The case that has gripped the nation for months has reached its conclusion. Brian Kohberger, accused and now convicted of the heinous murders of 4 University of Idaho students, has been sentenced to death. This chilling case has left many questions about justice, the legal process, and the lives affected. Join us as we break down the timeline, the evidence, and the emotional courtroom scenes that brought us to this dramatic verdict. On a quiet November night in 2022, the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, was shattered by a tragedy that would send shockwaves across the nation. 4 young students from the University of Idaho, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were brutally murdered in their off-campus home. The community, known for its tight-knit and peaceful atmosphere, was plunged into a state of fear and confusion, unable to comprehend the sheer horror of what had taken place. The events unfolded in the early morning hours of November 13th. According to investigators, the attack occurred between 4 and 4:30 a.m., while most of the occupants of the house were asleep. The house, located on King Road, was a popular hangout spot for students and known to be a safe haven for the victims and their friends. The layout of the house, with its multiple levels and entrances, initially presented challenges for investigators trying to piece together the events of that night. The first sign of trouble came hours later when a 911 call was made from one of the surviving roommates' phones, reporting an unconscious person. The call came around noon, long after the murders had been committed. When law enforcement arrived, they discovered a scene of unimaginable violence. The victims had been stabbed multiple times with what police would later describe as a fixed blade knife. 2 of the victims, Madison and Kaylee, were found together in one bedroom, while Zana and Ethan, a couple, were found in another. The surviving roommates, who were on a different floor, were unharmed and likely slept through the attack. As news of the murders spread, panic gripped the small town. Students fled campus, some refusing to return for the rest of the semester, and parents demanded answers. The police, however, were initially tight-lipped about details, leading to widespread speculation and fear. Who could have committed such a brutal act? Was the killer someone from the community, or had a stranger brought this horror to their doorstep? The victims themselves became the heart of the story as friends and family came forward to share memories of their lives. Kaylee Goncalves was described as a bright, ambitious young woman who was about to graduate and embark on new adventures. Madison Mogen, her best friend since childhood, was equally beloved, and the two were inseparable, even in death. Zana Kernodle was remembered for her vibrant personality and loving nature, and Ethan Chapin, her boyfriend, was a kind and outgoing young man who brought joy to everyone around him. Despite the overwhelming grief, the families of the victims were determined to seek justice. Memorials and vigils were held, not just in Moscow, but across the country. As the story gained national attention, the gruesome nature of the crime and the lack of an immediate suspect created a media frenzy, with armchair detectives and internet sleuths poring over every detail released by the police. The small police force in Moscow was under immense pressure to solve the case quickly, but the investigation proved to be anything but straightforward. Initially, law enforcement struggled to identify a suspect. The crime scene was chaotic, with evidence suggesting a frenzied attack. Questions arose about how the killer had entered and exited the home undetected, and why the surviving roommates were spared. Speculation swirled about a possible stalker or whether the attack was personal. Adding to the confusion, the police announced early on that the murders were a targeted attack, but they did not clarify who the target was or how they had come to that conclusion. For weeks, there were no significant leads, and the community's unease deepened. Businesses closed early, and students avoided walking alone. The lack of updates led to growing frustration among the victims' families, who called for more transparency from law enforcement. However, behind the scenes, investigators were painstakingly analyzing the crime scene, gathering forensic evidence, and reviewing hours of surveillance footage from the surrounding area. Eventually, a critical breakthrough came in the form of DNA evidence. At the crime scene, investigators found a single trace of DNA on the button snap of a knife sheath left behind by the killer. This tiny piece of evidence would later become the linchpin in the case against Brian Kohberger, a graduate student studying criminology at a nearby university. However, at the time, the public remained in the dark about the progress being made in the case. The horrific events of that night forever changed Moscow, Idaho, leaving an indelible mark on the community and everyone who followed the case. The initial fear and confusion gave way to a collective resolve to remember the victims and ensure justice was served. While the details of that night are now better understood, the shock and sorrow it caused continue to resonate. A reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can sometimes invade even the most idyllic of places. Brian Kohberger's journey from an anonymous graduate student to the prime suspect in the Idaho student murders is a chilling tale of how modern investigative techniques and community vigilance ultimately converge to identify him. Kohberger's background, his behaviors leading up to the crime, and the series of events that led to his arrest paint a disturbing picture of a man who may have been meticulously planning these acts for months. Kohberger, 28 years old at the time of the murders, was a PhD student studying criminology at Washington State University, located in Pullman, just a short drive from Moscow, Idaho. He was described by peers as intelligent, though socially awkward, and many who interacted with him noted his intense and sometimes unnerving demeanor. While his academic pursuits centered on understanding criminal behavior and the psychology of crime, it is now suspected that he may have been using his studies to plan and execute these murders. Investigators later revealed that Kohberger had an unsettling fascination with the criminal mind and violent behavior. Prior to his enrollment in Washington State University's graduate program, he had completed a master's degree in criminal justice, during which he conducted a controversial research study. The study involved asking criminals to share their thoughts and emotions during the commission of crimes, purportedly to gain deeper insights into criminal motivations. Critics would later suggest that this research could have served as a way for Kohberger to refine his own criminal intentions. In the months leading up to the murders, Kohberger's behavior raised red flags for those around him. He reportedly became more isolated and irritable, exhibiting signs of stress and agitation. Some of his classmates later recalled his sudden disinterest in their shared studies of criminology, as though he were preoccupied with something far more personal. What they didn't know was that Kohberger had allegedly been surveilling the King Road residence, a location that would become the focal point of one of the most heinous crimes in Idaho's history. Investigators pieced together Kohberger's movements before and after the murders, painting a picture of meticulous planning in an attempt to evade capture. Cell phone data revealed that Kohberger's phone had been near the victim's house on multiple occasions in the weeks leading up to the murders, often late at night. This suggested a pattern of stalking, as if he were studying the routines of the residents. On the night of the murders, his phone was turned off, presumably to avoid detection, but forensic analysis later showed a clear link between his movements and the crime scene. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was the white Hyundai Elantra Kohberger was driving at the time of the murders. Surveillance footage captured a vehicle matching its description near the crime scene during the early morning hours of November 13th. This discovery triggered an intensive search for the car, which ultimately led law enforcement to Kohberger. The vehicle became a pivotal element in building the case against him, as it was linked to his name, and investigators found it parked outside his parents' home in Pennsylvania when he was finally arrested. DNA evidence played a crucial role in solidifying Kohberger as the prime suspect. A single trace of DNA was discovered on a knife sheath left behind at the crime scene. This evidence was run through genealogical databases, leading to a partial match with a relative of Kohberger's. Once he was identified as a suspect, authorities secretly collected trash from his family's home in Pennsylvania, where he had returned for the holidays. The DNA recovered from the trash was a match to the DNA found at the scene, placing Kohberger directly at the location of the murders. In hindsight, many questioned how someone like Kohberger, with his background in criminology and apparent interest in understanding crime, could have been involved in such a brutal act. Some speculated that his academic pursuits were not merely scholarly, but part of a deeper obsession with criminal activity. Others wondered if his sense of intellectual superiority led him to believe he could commit the perfect crime and outsmart law enforcement. Friends, acquaintances, and professors described Kohberger as an enigmatic figure. While he was often seen as intelligent and driven, there were instances where his behavior seemed off-putting or even hostile. Reports surfaced of Kohberger making inappropriate or antagonistic comments in social situations, suggesting a disconnect in his ability to empathize with others. Those who knew him were stunned when his name became public, struggling to reconcile the image of the graduate student they knew with the horrific acts he was accused of committing. The timing of Kohberger's arrest was also significant. On December 30th, 2022, law enforcement apprehended him at his parents' home in Pennsylvania after tracking his movements for weeks. The arrest was a dramatic conclusion to the months-long investigation, with SWAT teams descending on the residence in a pre-dawn raid. Kohberger reportedly remained calm during the arrest, denying any involvement and asking if anyone else had been taken into custody, a cryptic comment that left many wondering about his state of mind. Kohberger's subsequent extradition to Idaho marked the beginning of the legal proceedings against him. The nation watched as the alleged killer was escorted into court, his demeanor cold and detached. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Kohberger maintained his innocence, pleading not guilty to the charges. The trial would reveal more about his actions and state of mind, but his arrest alone raised troubling questions about how someone with his profile could commit such a horrific act. The arrest and identification of Brian Kohberger as the prime suspect brought some relief to the victims' families and the community, but it also deepened the mystery surrounding his motives. Why did he target these particular students? Was this crime the culmination of years of planning or a spontaneous act of violence? As details about Kohberger's background and actions emerged, it became clear that this was not just a story of a crime, but a chilling insight into the mind of a suspected killer. The trial of Brian Kohberger was one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in recent history, as it sought to unravel the horrifying events that had gripped the nation. The courtroom became a battleground where prosecutors laid out their case against Kohberger, while his defense team sought to cast doubt on the evidence. It was a trial filled with tense moments, emotional testimonies, and groundbreaking forensic revelations. The prosecution's case hinged on a combination of forensic evidence, digital tracking, and witness accounts that painted a damning picture of Kohberger's guilt. At the heart of their argument was the DNA evidence found at the crime scene. The knife sheath left behind in one of the bedrooms bore a single trace of DNA on its button snap, which investigators linked to Kohberger through advanced genealogical methods. Prosecutors argued that the likelihood of this DNA belonging to anyone else was astronomically low, making it a critical piece of evidence that tied Kohberger directly to the murders. Digital forensics also played a significant role in the trial. Cell phone records revealed Kohberger's movements on the night of the murders, showing that his phone had been turned off during the critical time window, a suspicious action that prosecutors claimed was an attempt to avoid detection. Furthermore, location data from his phone revealed a pattern of visits to the victim's neighborhood in the weeks leading up to the crime, suggesting premeditation. Surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses also captured a white Hyundai Elantra, the same model Kohberger was driving, circling the area around the time of the murders. These digital breadcrumbs painted a chilling portrait of a methodically planned and executed crime. Witness testimonies added another layer of complexity to the trial. One of the most haunting accounts came from a surviving roommate who described hearing strange noises and seeing a masked figure in the house on the night of the murders. The witness's account, though incomplete, provided a glimpse into the chaos and terror of that night. While the defense attempted to question the reliability of this testimony, the prosecution emphasized that it corroborated other pieces of evidence, including the timeline established by phone records and surveillance footage. Forensic analysis of the crime scene further bolstered the prosecution's case. Experts testified about the nature of the wounds inflicted on the victims, suggesting that the attacker exhibited a high degree of aggression and control. The fixed-blade knife used in the killings was consistent with the sheath found at the scene, and the blood patterns provided clues about the sequence of events during the attack. Prosecutors argued that the sheer brutality of the murders pointed to a calculated and deliberate act, further implicating Kohberger. Kohberger's defense team faced an uphill battle as they sought to counter the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. Their strategy focused on questioning the integrity of the investigation and the handling of evidence. They raised concerns about potential contamination at the crime scene, given the large number of law enforcement personnel and forensic experts who had worked there. The defense also challenged the reliability of the DNA evidence, arguing that the single trace found on the knife sheath could have been transferred inadvertently and did not conclusively prove Kohberger's presence at the crime scene. Additionally, the defense sought to discredit the cell phone data, suggesting that it only showed Kohberger's general location and could not definitively place him at the house. They argued that his visits to the neighborhood could have been coincidental or related to his academic interests, as Kohberger had a known fascination with crime and criminology. This line of defense aimed to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors, though it struggled to overcome the weight of the evidence. The emotional impact of the trial was palpable, particularly during the testimonies of the victims' families. They shared heart-wrenching stories about the lives and aspirations of their loved ones, painting a vivid picture of the devastating loss they had endured. Their statements served as a powerful reminder of the human toll of the crime, leaving many in the courtroom visibly moved. The prosecution used these testimonies to underscore the gravity of the case and the need for justice. Perhaps one of the most dramatic moments of the trial came during the cross-examination of forensic experts. The defense sought to exploit any inconsistencies in their analyses, but the experts remained steadfast, reinforcing the reliability of their findings. The prosecution's closing arguments tied together all the evidence, presenting a compelling narrative of Kohberger's actions and intent. They argued that the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to his guilt and that the murders were the result of a deliberate and calculated plan. Throughout the trial, Kohberger maintained a stoic demeanor, showing little emotion even as the details of the gruesome murders were recounted. His lack of visible reaction became a point of discussion among observers, with some interpreting it as a sign of cold detachment, while others saw it as a calculated attempt to maintain an air of innocence. Regardless of his courtroom behavior, the evidence presented against him was enough to sway the jury. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict: guilty on all charges. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow from the victims' families, who had endured months of uncertainty and anguish. The conviction marked a significant step toward justice, though it could never fully heal the wounds caused by the tragedy. The trial of Brian Kohberger will be remembered not only for its legal complexities but also for its profound emotional impact. It brought to light the horrors of the crime and the meticulous efforts of law enforcement to solve it. As the case concluded, the focus shifted to the sentencing phase, where the ultimate question of justice, whether Kohberger would face the death penalty, would be decided. For the families and the community, the trial was a painful but necessary step in their journey toward closure. The sentencing phase of Brian Kohberger's trial was one of the most emotionally charged and polarizing moments in the case, as the court deliberated whether he should face the death penalty for the brutal murders of the 4 University of Idaho students. This stage brought forth intense emotions, philosophical debates, and impassioned arguments from both sides, as the families of the victims and Kohberger himself faced the ultimate judgment of the legal system. The prosecution began the sentencing phase by emphasizing the sheer brutality and premeditation of Kohberger's actions. They painted a vivid and harrowing picture of the crime, reminding the court of the unimaginable pain inflicted on the victims and their families. The prosecutor described the attack as a calculated and heinous act of violence that demonstrated a complete disregard for human life. They highlighted the evidence that showed Kohberger had stalked the victims for weeks, meticulously planning the murders and ensuring that he would leave behind as little evidence as possible. This, they argued, was not a crime of passion but one of deliberate cruelty, warranting the harshest penalty available under the law. The families of the victims took center stage during this phase, delivering powerful and heart-wrenching victim impact statements. Parents, siblings, and friends stood before the court, their voices trembling with grief and anger as they recounted the profound loss they had suffered. Kaylee Goncalves' mother spoke about her daughter's dreams of starting a family and pursuing a successful career, dreams that were cruelly stolen from her. Madison Mogan's father described the unbearable void left in their family and the anguish of knowing his daughter's life was taken in such a violent manner. Zana Kernodle's siblings shared memories of her vibrant personality and how her laughter once filled their home. Ethan Chapin's parents, fighting through tears, spoke of their pride in their son and the heartbreak of a future that would never come to pass. These statements not only underscored the human toll of Kohberger's actions, but also served as a rallying cry for justice. Many family members explicitly called for the death penalty, arguing that anything less would be insufficient for the magnitude of the crime. Their words resonated deeply with those in the courtroom and across the nation, as the sentencing phase was broadcast widely and followed by millions. The defense, in stark contrast, sought to humanize Kohberger and argue against the death penalty. They presented mitigating factors, including Kohberger's troubled upbringing and struggles with mental health. His attorneys contended that he was not beyond redemption and that a sentence of life without parole would be a severe and appropriate punishment that allowed for the possibility of rehabilitation. They argued that the death penalty was not only irreversible but also inherently flawed, citing statistics about wrongful convictions and disparities in its application. While the defense did not deny the severity of the crime, they urged the court to consider the broader ethical and moral implications of capital punishment. A significant portion of the defense's argument focused on Kohberger's behavior since his arrest. They highlighted his cooperation with law enforcement and his adherence to courtroom decorum, framing these as signs of a man who could potentially reflect on his actions and grow over time. However, these arguments were met with skepticism from the prosecution and the victims' families, who saw them as hollow attempts to deflect attention from the gravity of the crime. The public reaction to the sentencing phase was deeply divided. Supporters of the death penalty argued that it was the only way to ensure true justice for the victims and their families. They viewed Kohberger's actions as so heinous that the ultimate punishment was not only justified, but necessary to send a message that such crimes would not be tolerated. Opponents of the death penalty, however, expressed concern about the morality and effectiveness of capital punishment, with some arguing that a life sentence would be a harsher and more fitting punishment for Kohberger, forcing him to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. The judge presiding over the case faced an enormous responsibility in deciding Kohberger's fate. In their remarks, the judge acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the crime and the profound suffering it had caused. They weighed the arguments presented by both sides, as well as the emotional pleas of the victims' families, before delivering their final judgment. When the sentence of death was announced, the courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of bittersweet relief, a recognition that justice had been served, but also a reminder that no verdict could ever bring back their loved ones. Some embraced one another, tears streaming down their faces, while others sat silently, the weight of the moment etched on their expressions. Kohberger, in contrast, remained stoic, showing no visible reaction to the decision. The sentencing reignited national debates about the death penalty, with legal experts, activists, and commentators weighing in on the implications of the case. Some viewed the sentence as a necessary response to a crime of such magnitude, while others questioned whether it reflected broader systemic issues in the justice system. Regardless of one's stance on the issue, the case became a focal point for discussions about justice, morality, and the role of capital punishment in modern society. In the days following the sentencing, the victims' families expressed a mixture of emotions in public statements. While many felt a sense of closure, they also acknowledged that the pain of their loss would never fully subside. They spoke of their desire to honor the memories of their loved ones by advocating for campus safety and supporting other families affected by violent crimes. As Brian Kohberger was escorted out of the courtroom to await his execution, the case entered a new phase, one marked by appeals and the long, uncertain process of the death penalty system. For the families of the victims and the community of Moscow, Idaho, the sentencing represented a measure of justice, but it also served as a sobering reminder of the enduring impact of the tragedy. The debate surrounding the case and its outcome ensured that its legacy would continue to resonate for years to come. The legacy of the Idaho student murders extends far beyond the tragedy itself, shaping conversations about safety, justice, and the enduring impact of loss. As the case closed with Brian Kohberger's sentencing, the community of Moscow, Idaho, and the nation as a whole we're left to grapple with the questions and lessons brought to light by this horrific crime. The ripple effects of these events continue to influence individuals, institutions, and society at large. For the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the legacy is deeply personal. Their lives are forever changed by the loss of their loved ones, and their efforts to honor their memories have become a cornerstone of how this tragedy will be remembered. The families have spoken publicly about their determination to ensure that their children's lives are not defined solely by their deaths. They have established scholarships, organized memorial events, and advocated for better safety measures on college campuses. These initiatives are meant to celebrate the victims' vibrant personalities, accomplishments, and dreams while creating a lasting positive impact in their names. The University of Idaho and other academic institutions across the country have faced a reckoning in the wake of these murders. The university's once tranquil campus was thrust into the national spotlight, raising urgent questions about student safety and the measures in place to protect young people living in off-campus housing. In response, the university implemented enhanced security protocols, including improved lighting, increased patrols, and stronger support systems for students. Other universities have followed suit, conducting reviews of their own safety measures and encouraging students to take precautions. The tragedy served as a grim reminder that even in close-knit, seemingly safe communities, vigilance is necessary. The role of social media and the internet in the aftermath of the murders has also become a key part of the legacy. As the case gained national and international attention, the internet became a double-edged sword, a place where people could share support and information, but also where misinformation and speculation ran rampant. Armchair detectives flooded platforms like Reddit, TikTok, and YouTube with theories about the case, some of which targeted innocent individuals and caused harm. This phenomenon raised important ethical questions about the boundaries of true crime content and the responsibilities of those discussing ongoing investigations online. For the victims' families, the proliferation of misinformation added another layer of pain, forcing them to correct false narratives while grieving. Law enforcement and the legal system were also deeply affected by the case. The investigation showcased both the strengths and challenges of modern policing. The use of advanced forensic techniques, such as genetic genealogy, was pivotal in identifying Kohberger and bringing him to justice. This success has been hailed as a milestone in criminal investigations, highlighting the potential of technology to solve even the most complex cases. However, the case also exposed gaps in communication and coordination among law enforcement agencies, particularly in the early stages of the investigation. These lessons have prompted calls for better training and resource allocation to ensure that future cases are handled with greater efficiency and transparency. The broader societal implications of the case cannot be overstated. The murders sparked a national conversation about the prevalence of violence and the factors that contribute to such acts. Kohberger's background, including his studies in criminology and his alleged fascination with crime, raised unsettling questions about the intersection of academic inquiry and deviant behavior. Experts have debated whether his academic pursuits may have fueled his criminal actions, or whether they were simply a reflection of his pre-existing interests. This debate has prompted a re-examination of how society views and addresses individuals with violent tendencies. For the residents of Moscow, Idaho, the murders left an indelible mark on their sense of safety and community. Once a place known for its small-town charm and close-knit relationships, Moscow became synonymous with tragedy in the national media. The residents have worked tirelessly to reclaim their town's identity, organizing events and initiatives aimed at healing and rebuilding trust. Vigils, community gatherings, and support networks have played a crucial role in helping the town move forward, though the scars of the tragedy remain. The case also underscored the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the unimaginable pain and loss, the families, friends, and community members affected by the murders have demonstrated remarkable strength and unity. Their determination to seek justice and create positive change serves as an inspiration to others facing similar challenges. It is a testament to the power of collective action and the importance of supporting one another in times of crisis. One of the most lasting aspects of the legacy is the awareness it has raised about the importance of compassion and vigilance. The murders were a stark reminder that life can change in an instant, and that acts of violence can occur anywhere, even in places that feel safe. This awareness has led many people to reevaluate their priorities, cherish their loved ones, and take steps to protect their communities. As the story of the Idaho student murders continues to be told, it remains a powerful example of the complexities of human behavior and the enduring impact of loss. The victims, though gone, are remembered not only for the tragedy of their deaths, but also for the joy and light they brought to the world. Their legacy lives on through the actions of those who loved them, the changes inspired by their story, and the lessons learned from one of the most harrowing cases in recent memory.